I represent, or my company's activities are part of the energy sector. Energy at the moment represents only about less than 20% of that 2.1 billion tonnes of emissions. The 2.1 billion tonnes is very predominantly a reflection of what happens in the forestry industry and in peat farming. But energy is the most rapidly growing of the sectors, and by 2020 it will represent 35% roughly of the emissions from the entire nation. By 2030, closer to 50%. The drivers for that rapid growth, or that rapid increase in the proportion of emissions coming from energy, are the obvious ones. A rapid pace of economic development, which means that people can buy bigger, less efficient houses and install air conditioning in those houses to keep themselves cool. And that leads to, of course, rapid growth in electricity demand. And electricity demand is the economy here is growing at 6% a year. Electricity demand is growing at closer to 12% a year. Virtually impossible for government and industry to keep pace with that growth in demand, actually. It's related to increase in natural gas use. It's related to increases in ownership of personal vehicles. There'll be 7.5 million additional motorcycles put on the road in Indonesia, most of them in Java, just in this calendar year. I think a remarkable statistic is that only 4% of primary energy use in this country is from renewable energy, renewable sources. And if there's any country in the world, any country in Asia that should have a very high proportion of its primary energy use related to renewable sources of energy, it's this one. And I hope that later on through the questioning we can come back to that issue. We know that the President has confirmed just yesterday, and to my knowledge that's the fourth time in a public forum that the President has reaffirmed that the country will reduce its emissions by 26% at least, and with some assistance from the OECD by 41% in 9 years actually. For the energy sector, that represents, it's a fairly specific number. It's about, if we are to reduce emissions from the energy sector by 2020 by 26%, that's 230 million tonnes of global warming pollutants, CO2 equivalent. For 41%, it's 370 million tonnes. As part of a collective organisation in this country that got going last year and already has about 60 members, I think, called the Association for Low Carbon Businesses in Indonesia, ALBI. That organisation's, most of this analysis comes from collective work by the companies in that group. That group's identified the different abatement options that Indonesia has at its disposal. The abatement levers for power generation are, and they'll be obvious to everybody in this room, but worth restating. The substitution of fossil fuels by renewable sources of energy, the substitution of oil and coal by natural gas, particularly natural gas, combined cycle gas turbine type power generation, the installation of supercritical boilers and other clean coal technology. There are none in Indonesia at the moment, and the deployment of carbon capture and storage. And for transportation, the abatement levers, again, very obvious. Increase in engine efficiencies. I wish I could say that wasn't rocket science, but in fact it is. It is rocket science. And the use of biofuels and gas. So as I said, we've identified, as a group, have identified 230 million tonnes of energy sector abatement. We think that is easily achievable. The coordinating minister talked about the cost of abatement versus the cost of not taking any action. The cost of abatement is actually, for this country, remarkably cheap. For more developed economies, the United States and Japan, the marginal costs of abatement are very high. They're not high in Indonesia, they're not. We have very easily identified 230 million tonnes of abatement activities that could begin tomorrow, in fact have. The cost to everybody involved in that abatement effort, about $20 per tonne of CO2. Now that equates, in 2020, that will equate to about $1.5 billion of expenditure. That, just to put that in context, that is 15% of the current annual fuel subsidy bill in this country. 15%. If you go to 41% reduction, and the 370 million tonnes that I mentioned, the costs are a little higher because you have to go to slightly more complex solutions, not much more complex actually. There the costs are $35 a tonne of CO2. If you add that all up, it comes to about 80% of 1 year of Indonesia's fuel subsidy bill. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Just one closing sentence, which is that this is all very achievable. It's all very, very achievable, but it's going to require a coherent national energy policy. It's going to have to be implemented soon, and that policy is going to have to coordinate and direct public and private investment.
Congratulations to all the speakers for sticking to time. I know it's really tough to get a core message across about your companies that you've built and run in 5 minutes. I don't know whether it's harder in 10 minutes or in 3 minutes, but anyway, you do a great job in 5. That leaves us about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. I'm not going to ask any questions of the panel. I would love to. I've even got my questions prepared, but I can see we've got a packed house. So I'm going to throw the questions straight over to the audience. And my understanding is that we don't have any prepared questions or any planted questions by any of the panelists. So this is a brave moment because you can ask anything you like and the panelists will do their best to answer it. And they'll be as brief as you are in asking the questions. So please, no presentations, please just questions. And then the panelists will please just give answers, okay? That's the only rule I'd ask for. So who wants to ask the first question? Yes, we have our first question, and people meanwhile pluck up the courage to ask the second question while we're having the first question. Thank you. And if you could say who you are, and if you represent an organization, the name of the organization, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Tito. I'm from Molindo, an ethanol company. This is a specific question for brandmates. As we know that Indonesia is known for the largest geothermal potential country in the world. I would like to know what is your experience on developing one of the first geothermal generator in Indonesia, the Wayang Windu. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Wayang Windu has actually been going for 11 years now. So it was explored and developed in a totally different political setting, if you like. It is the most efficient project in the world, and I admire my company for being able to say that, but it's partly the luck of the geography that it is just an amazing, the best steam field that's yet been developed in the world. And I mention that because it goes to the heart of your question. And your statement that Indonesia has the most geothermal potential in the world is undeniable. In fact, of the easily commercializable geothermal that's identifiable in the world, Indonesia has significantly more than half. So it's somewhere between 55 and 60% of the global potential for geothermal. And it's an enormous potential competitive advantage for Indonesia total potential here, we think, my own company analysis, is about 30 gigawatts.